Today I want to talk about the indemnity provisions in consulting services contracts in particular, but similar principles apply in all contracts. So the indemnity, the liability regime seems to be the thing that really freaks people out, and I think that's probably warranted. Historically, principals and head contractors have tended to introduce really wide indemnity regimes into contracts that shift the allocation of risk maybe to the consultant or the designer in ways that sometimes might not be insurable. So there is something to be concerned about. I'm hopeful that that's going to shift again a little bit now with the introduction of the unfair contract terms legislation last year, but it's still a bit of wait and see at the moment. Some businesses have definitely toned down their indemnities, but some, they're still really wide. So if you're a consultant and you want to know what you should be looking for in your indemnity clause, I want to give you some really quick, simple tips, things to look for. So an indemnity, it's a promise to pay for a loss. So if the consultant does something wrong and their client suffers a loss, then the consultant is probably going to have to is liable to compensate the other party for that loss. That promise exists as part of a commercial contract, whether there's an indemnity clause or not. But we do tend to have an express indemnity clause to really, I guess, settle everyone's expectations about who's going to be responsible for what in the delivery of the contract. So if you're a consultant, you've got professional indemnity insurance. Your professional indemnity insurance is usually going to respond to fault. And we sometimes say that's like the general law position or the common law position, that professional indemnity insurance will respond when a loss is suffered because the consultant did something wrong. So that's the number one thing to look for in the indemnity. Is it linked to fault? You're going to see that as something like the consultant will be responsible for all losses, claims, liabilities, etc., resulting from a negligent act or omission of the consultant or a breach of the contract or something that involves wrongdoing. So that's tip number one. Is the indemnity linked to fault? The second thing that I always want consultants to look for is a proportionate reduction of liability. So this is often at the end of the indemnity clause, and it'll say something like, this indemnity is reduced to the extent that the principal or the other party caused or contributed to the loss. That's important for consultants because often you really are working to the other party's direction, their specification or their instructions. So you want to make sure that the indemnity confirms that you, the consultant, are only going to be responsible for the things that you actually did. And if what you did was changed by the other party, then the other party should be responsible for the losses that they caused themselves. So that's tip number 2, proportionate reduction of liability. Tip number 3, I always want to see a limitation of liability. Always. No consultant should be entering into a contract with unlimited liability, particularly because the consultant's fees are usually a tiny proportion of the overall capital expenditure on something that they're designing. So a limit of liability, that's tip number 3. And an extension of that tip also is an exclusion of consequential loss. It's fine for that exclusion to be mutual, but I always want to see that consequential losses, so they're the indirect losses, the financial losses, the loss of profit or opportunity or production, the consultant should be responsible for those. So I want to see that in the indemnity regime as well. So there you go, 4 quick tips, things to look for in your indemnity regime to try and make sure that it's within insurable losses, and also that you're setting expectations about the level of exposure that you're prepared to tolerate in a contract. So number 1, is this indemnity fault-based? Number 2, is there a proportionate reduction of liability? Number 3, is there a limitation of liability? And number 4, is there an exclusion of consequential loss? There we go, pretty easy.